The Norman and Florence Brodie Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
The emancipation of the slaves after the American Civil War was followed in the late 19th century by the so-called Jim Crow laws in the South, in a systematic effort to keep African Americans not only separate from whites, but oppressed and deprived of basic rights as citizens. While Northern blacks fared better, they too faced discrimination in housing, education, and many other areas of life. Then, in the 1960s, a series of civil rights acts banned racial segregation in voting, employment, schools, housing, and public places. While progress toward equality has been made, as witnessed by the election of America's first black president, many people believe that much more needs to be done in the areas of civil rights, education, and housing. Joining us to discuss the issue of race in America is Stephan Thernstrom, a research professor of history at Harvard University and co-author of America in Black and White, One Nation, Indivisible. And now the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Stephan Thernstrom, welcome to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Glad to be here.
In fact, welcome back. You've written extensively about race, often with your wife, Abigail Thernstrom. But you're a historian. So how did you get interested in race as a topic for research and writing?
Well, I am a social historian, and since graduate school days, my interest was not primarily in Abraham Lincoln, Grover Cleveland, the kind of classic political figures, mainstream national politics. I was interested in the changing life of ordinary Americans, and as a young scholar, I wrote various things about we need to do grassroots social history. And once you start thinking about who are the American people, it's hard to neglect the fact that a significant proportion of them have been black. So from the beginning of my research and teaching careers, I've been interested in the changing situation of African Americans.
Let me, if I may, take you through some of those changes. From the Civil War onward, certainly among Negroes at the time, there were great hopes after the war was over. What happened in that immediate post-war period?
Well, you had a very brief period of Reconstruction. In the textbooks, it's 1865 to 1877, but if you think of Reconstruction in the narrower sense of new state governments that wrote state constitutions that gave equal rights to black people, and that's how the Congressional Reconstruction, defined it. The average regime in these places only in southern states lasted something like 2.1 years.
And that's with blacks being elected.
With blacks being allowed to vote, blacks in political office, and so-called carpetbaggers, northern Republicans who moved south for greater opportunity and who often were involved in politics. But since you did have governments which depended on winning elections, Southern whites, initially there were a few Southern whites disaffected from, who had been anti-slavery before, or disaffected for other reasons, who cooperated with blacks and carpetbaggers. But before long, they were intimidated into supporting a return to the old order. So, in fact,
it's hard
blacks,
to believe, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if it's a truly democratic system, it's difficult to believe that many of the old ways wouldn't come back because there was so much support in the South for the war and for, if not slavery, at least for the old ways.
Yes, no, exactly, and that indeed is what happened. So that blacks are not immediately disenfranchised. That happens later, and mainly in the 1890s. But they become a political minority, and their economic position is dismal, and by some measures, free blacks living in the South in 1880 had a lower standard of living than they did under slavery, because under slavery, slaves were pretty well fed, we now know, and they were pretty well fed because their masters were smart enough to think that this is a valuable machine I've got here. I better change the oil regularly. I better keep people who do all this hard physical labor pretty well fed because they're burning a lot of calories. And that actually is a somewhat distinctive feature of slavery in the United States. In the Caribbean, slaves were literally worked to death and were readily replaced. There was an open slave trade, but particularly after the slave trade was closed here in 1808, the slave standard of living was likewise medical care. Slaves did get medical care for the same reason that you would, if your car is making a grinding noise, you get automotive care.
If the white establishment had been able to regain control without disenfranchising the blacks, why in the 1890s did they go further?
Well, they went further because there were small signs that blacks and poor whites were forming some alliance as part of the populist movement. And the populist challenge, see, the Republican Party pretty much disappears in the South. It had been the party of the blacks, the party of these interfering Northerners. But the Populist Party then formed a challenge, a quite powerful challenge, to the Democratic establishment. And in some places, not all, blacks were aligning themselves with white populists. You know, they had a common class interest. And that was quite terrifying to the ruling groups in the South. And so, in response to that challenge, they pass a series of measures that limits the franchise, sharply reduces the number of blacks voting, and also the number of poor whites voting.
These are poll taxes and all sorts of things.
Yes, right, literacy tests.
Did the North, did the Congress, the U.S. Congress, react at all?
Yes, there were, nothing got through Congress, but Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, a senator, was greatly concerned about this, led the charge against it. There were bills he had in the Senate to send Northern troops back down if the South didn't behave better, but he couldn't get enough support for that. And then the Supreme Court implicitly endorses this in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which contends that local communities have police power to make reasonable classifications of people, and that deciding that you should have racial segregation in all public facilities, on transportation, in public schools, drinking fountains and everything, that was not inconsistent with the equal protection of the laws guaranteed under the 14th Amendment.
And I imagine all the southern states are back in the Union. They are now fully represented in Congress.
Yes.
So although the population is small, so they may not be a large portion of the House of Representatives, they're well represented in the Senate.
Indeed.
Making action more difficult if they, if the Southern Democrats, as we used to call them, make common cause with Northern Democrats. so one can see this development. So this is called, among other things, Jim Crow.
Yes.
And it's not just voting, I take it, it's a systematic effort to keep black Americans, is the right word, oppressed?
Yes, I think so. This was more than a notion that blacks and whites have equal rights, but they're better off not mixing too much. It clearly was an effort to keep blacks subordinate to whites, was part of a whole theory of white supremacy.
Now, I think I learned this from your writings, and we'll get to the civil rights movement in a moment. But it is important then to think about northern blacks and southern blacks because of the different opportunities northern blacks had. Is that right?
All right, well, first, let me just preface that by saying over 90% of black people lived in the South at the beginning of the 20th century. By 1940, it was down to 78%. By 1965, it was down to a little over half. So you had a huge movement of blacks from the South to the North, both around World War I and into the 20s, and then again in the 40s and 50s. And the primary reason is first, greater economic opportunity and higher standards of living in the North. During World War I, with this first migration of blacks, there's such an acute labor shortage because suddenly European immigration is cut off in 1914 by the outbreak of a world war. So you don't have more immigrants coming from southern Italy, Poland, Greece, and so on, and yet you have booming industry. So they begin to hire blacks, you know, as a last resort in the meat packing companies of Chicago and the steel mills and so on. So that's one thing. Second, much greater personal liberty. Now, there was intense white prejudice against blacks, certainly. It would show up, for example, in the unwillingness of most whites to live in a neighborhood that had any black faces visible in it. But compared to the South, they are legally equal citizens. There's quite a bit of competition for the black vote. Most blacks, given the Civil War experience and the nature of the Democratic Party, were Republican. They were as heavily Republican in the 1920s as they are Democratic today, 90 plus
Often forgotten.
percent.
Often forgotten.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And these northern blacks, especially the ones that had that 10% that had been there at the turn of the century, but they were doctors and lawyers and a professional class, no?
Yes, I mean, it was not very strongly developed, but there was, to some extent, there certainly was a professional class of sorts. Now, the largest single profession held by blacks in 1920, I think it was undertaker, which isn't exactly where they had a captive market, and the white morticians would not work on black corpses, so there was a sheltered market.
Well, the reason I'm getting to this or talking about this is because I'm trying to get a flavor for where the civil rights movement came from. Mm-hmm. As we look back now more than 50, 60 years, we tend to think of it as one or two leaders who somehow convinced the Congress to do whatever. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it does feel as if this was a movement, a mass movement with many people, white and black, involved. But I wanted to focus a little bit on the African Americans because it seems as if they had developed a critical mass in, if not the middle class, something like that, so that this became a higher, civil rights became a higher issue on their agenda. Do I have that right, or how do you see it?
Yes, no, I mean, I think it's a natural tendency to think civil rights movement, oh yes, this divine figure, Martin Luther King, suddenly appeared and persuaded people. There were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who in one way or another contributed to the movement. It grows up in the South, and it's fascinating. It grows up within the black churches. But crucial to that is that their followers, their parishioners in their churches, and lots of other blacks, joined in and were willing to put their bodies on the line in nonviolent protest, to sit in at lunch counters and say, we won't leave until you serve us like other human beings. A tremendous amount of personal courage and commitment in a highly disciplined social movement.
March on Washington, Selma, passage of civil rights laws, voting rights, so forth. 40 more years, 50 more years, the election of first black president. And yet there is a feeling that this isn't over, that there's still much to do. And in fact, there's, I think, a substantial racial divide, with whites thinking we've made much more progress than blacks think we've made. Two questions. What's your sense about how much progress we've made, and then why the racial divide?
Well, I think certainly we've made enormous progress by almost everything you can measure. Certainly income levels of black, the quality of the housing they occupy, the educational achievements they have made, whatever area you look that is related to public policy, things are dramatically better than they were 50 years ago. Now, there certainly is a racial divide in perceptions of the society, and there certainly are still huge racial disparities. I mean, black poverty rate is higher, the black unemployment rate is higher, the black rate of dropping out of high school is higher, black performance on standardized tests of every sort, they are clustered very heavily near the bottom, so they're, even when they're college graduates, they are not comparable to the average white college graduate in their cognitive skills.
And there's still some residual of discrimination.
Sure. Though there is an enormous body not only of laws protecting against discrimination, but public policies enforcing racial double standards, so that it becomes far easier for black applicants to law schools, medical schools, colleges in general, and similar preferences in employment, as was shown in the recent New Haven firefighters case, where racial double standards have to be used to get more blacks hired or admitted to particular programs.
So you're not writing a book, a little bit on this topic, about continued social segregation. Tell us what you mean by social segregation, which is a phrase I got from you, and then tell us what you're finding.
Yeah. Well, the starting point of this book is contemplation of what the civil rights movement was all about. It was about destroying segregation, legally enforced compulsory separation of the races with the purpose of keeping one race under the heel of the other. That was very clearly what we had throughout the South down into the 1960s. That's what King was crusading against. But when you've won that battle, then the question is, well, what do we want to follow? What should we expect? And here there are two alternatives. One is we expect racial integration, in the sense that when the society is properly organized, if blacks are 13% of the population, they will be 13%, no more, no less, of brain surgeons and bus drivers. They will live 13% of every block, whatever. That kind of integrationist ideal, many people thought that was what the end of segregation would mean. But there is another way of thinking about this, and here I would cite Malcolm X, who in general is not one of my favorite thinkers, but Malcolm X said it's essential to distinguish segregation from separation. He said segregation is imposed on supposed inferiors by supposed superiors. And that fairly describes what you had in the South before the 1960s. Separation is a voluntary choice between equals. And the question of what is this fundamentally a pluralist society with many different groups, often ethnically or racially based, but beyond that, religiously based, whatever, in which we might expect neighborhoods that have institutions devoted that serve a particular population, to have more people from that population living nearby. Would we expect every block to be a microcosm of the population of the United States? And indeed, since it's so popular now to say we want diverse cities, cities are wonderful when they're diverse, well, they're diverse when they have a Chinatown, an Italian neighborhood, other visibly different places. And if they were like Salt Lake City, say, where if there are ethnically or racially different people, they're so scattered, it leaves no imprint on the landscape. That's, in some ways, the antithesis of diversity.
Now that's housing or living separation. Are there other areas where you see this happening?
Yes, I think, take religion, very important. I mean, Martin Luther King was fond of saying, I think it got his white donors to cough up money and to feel guilty, Sunday morning is the most segregated hour of the year, of the week. But did King really mean then that a lot of blacks should be going to predominantly white churches and a lot of white folks should be going to the black churches? Even today, the major black denominations, which are 98% black in their membership, have something like 60% of all black churchgoers going. So there is racial integration in religion now, a lot more than there was 50 years ago. But there still are many racially identifiable churches. And from an integrationist point of view, that's a social problem. I mean, churches are very important as a source of friendship and of marriage, for example. And to the extent to which blacks are going to their own churches, they're more likely to have their most intimate friends be black, and they're more likely to marry within the race. And so, there are difficult issues there. But I think on the whole, I am a pluralist who is accepting of that. And I've read some of the literature on Jewish social behavior and find a recent survey, 2002 I think, found that half of all blacks said that half or more of all their close friends were half of all Jews said their close friends were Jews. And among those who were active in Jewish institutions, the synagogue or whatever, it was 80%. Now, that means they're not going to have as many black friends as they might at random because there are not many blacks who go to the synagogue. But I do not see that as a problem.
But if I could, let me ask you to, tie it all together. Surely there are places where we want to make sure that the segregation is minimal, not erased. Mm-hmm. And in some settings, whether that's employment or whatever, that means measuring the degree of integration. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. And indeed, the standard studies that say they did measure segregation by saying, well, what would this look like if race had no effect on what neighborhood you lived in? Well, every neighborhood would be 13% black, and so how much does the pattern you see deviate from that? That's all right if you keep it purely statistical, and recall that's just a kind of way of measuring things. It's a yardstick, but investigators almost invariably, when they then say, well, segregation levels are very high, they're alarmingly high, they're not declining as much as they should. I mean, all of this normative judgment
Just without taking that into account.
comes in.
Well, this is going to be a book. I hope you will come back when the book is completed and share your findings with us. Steve Thernstrom, thank you again for being with us on Policy Watch and being here at the University of Maryland. For our viewing audience, let me remind you, if you want to contact us, you can do so. It's PolicyWatch at UMD, that's UMD for University of Maryland, .edu. And again, thank you very much for watching.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.